Canada's use of the Emergencies Act is coming to an end. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says it will be revoked tonight, several days after police cleared Ottawa's streets of trucks and protesters. The CBC's David Cochrane is with us now to help us break it down. David, what underpinned this decision? Why now?
Yeah, Vashi, it looks like the situation in Ottawa has just gotten more and more stable, since the police action started on Friday and really continued into Sunday. And there was some concern even on Monday when this went to a vote in the House of Commons that there were still pockets of protesters in the city. But more urgently, the NDP and the Liberals both cited concerns about gatherings of protesters in some of the more rural outskirts of the city of Ottawa, where there was a significant number of trucks and no guarantee that they wouldn't try to come back. But since then, the numbers at these, encampments, these retreating points, have diminished even further. And you look at the money that was fueling a lot of this, that has been further cut off and obstructed through the freezing of accounts and the drying up of crowdfunding. But perhaps more importantly, Vashi, the leadership of this movement is either in jail or on bail with strict conditions, right? Chris Barber was arrested. He was the first one to be taken into custody by police last week. He's been released on bail, but told to get out of Ontario and have no contact with anyone connected with the convoy. Tamara Leach was denied bail and remains in police custody. And Pat King, who's one of the main influencers, he won't know his fate until his bail decision is rendered on Friday. So all of these gravitational forces of money and organizers that were sort of holding this together, those have been removed from the equation, and the numbers at the rallying points that the protesters and the big trucks retreated to have just diminished steadily over the last several days. And you can see a change even here in Ottawa, Vashi, with the police posture. They're taking down fencing and removing barricades, allowing more and more access into what was called the red zone that had a hard police perimeter for several days as they were trying to get this under control. And I think it's safe to say that even with or without these powers, Vashi, the Ottawa police have learned a hard lesson. And if they do see a bunch of big rigs coming towards the downtown, they're unlikely to allow them to occupy Wellington Street in any force in the future. So given that change in circumstance, the revocation of the orders willingly by the Prime Minister, it remains to be seen what the NDP would say, Vashi, whether they were getting to the point that they were going to waver in their support for this based on the relative calm and peace here in the capital city of the last 48 hours.
Let's just quickly touch on that. We've got the Minister of Public Safety coming up, and I'll put some of these questions to him. But the politics of this have been interesting, right? A bit of a political hot potato with the opposition Conservatives saying that this was political overreach, right? That they accused the government of trying to almost use this act to increase their own powers in a nefarious way. How do you see that playing out going forward?
Well, look, the big thing that happens now is the debate is over in the Senate. The motion there has been withdrawn, and within 60 days there has to be this inquiry, which is the accountability mechanism. And they'll have to figure out exactly how that committee is constituted, but it will look at the circumstances that led to this. It will look at the policing, the money, the disinformation, and sort of render a written decision, I guess, in some way, explaining whether or not that this was particularly justified, or at least laying out, after hearing evidence and experts, whether the circumstances warranted or not. But certainly, the Conservatives are going to continue to prosecute this argument that this was dictatorial overreach, certainly backed by the Bloc Québécois, though the Liberals can point to the fact that it wasn't until they brought in these emergency powers and were able to bring police forces from the National Police Force and from 4 separate provinces together to clear out the occupation in Ottawa. It wasn't until that happened that they could win the battle for Wellington Street. They just now continue the fight with the Conservatives to see who can win the argument with the Canadian public.
Okay, thanks so much, David. Appreciate your insights as always. The CBC's David Cochrane here in our newsroom. As I mentioned, we are joined now by Marco Mendocino. He's the Minister of Public Safety, also here in the capital city. Hi, Minister. Good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
Welcome back, Vashi.
I appreciate that. I listened to the Prime Minister's press conference just last hour. He said in his comments that as of Monday, Ottawa and border crossings were in the clear. Why wasn't the act revoked right then?
Well, in short, because there were still risks. There were efforts to resurrect blockades out west in South Surrey, BC. We'd heard some chatter as well in Windsor. And in the meantime, law enforcement required some additional cushion to shore up existing authorities so that we could make the transition that we did today. Vashi, we said that when we invoked the Emergencies Act, we needed to. It was a nonpartisan, professional, informed decision by law enforcement. All of the powers that we used were effective at addressing the illegal blockades and occupation in Ottawa. We exercised restraint and responsibility and transparency. And so today we were able to take that decision.
I just want to be clear, though, because when I listened to your interviews Monday evening, it wasn't so clear by which marker you would be judging that the act was no longer needed, right? You said this threat was still there, that law enforcement was advising you that it was still needed, but the Prime Minister pointed out today in his own words that the threat was cleared, right? That the situation in Ottawa, the situation at the border crossings that rose to the level of invoking the act were over on Monday. You open yourself up, do you not, to those criticisms that I was just talking about with David from the opposition about overreach, right? Why not, right at the second you knew that the acute emergency was over, was the act not revoked?
Well, the streets may have been clear, but the risks were not. And there's a threshold under the law that police were continually advising us on and taking a look not only at the progress that we had made, but equally whether or not there might be a return of some of those who were parked just outside of Ottawa, for example, or outside of certain ports of entry. And as a result of those risks, there was an ongoing need to use effective tools, like, for example, designating certain zones as being no-go under the Emergencies Act. That was a very powerful and effective deterrent to keep those away. The financial controls, which was a soft kind of disincentive that didn't require any physical force. Again, a very effective tool to ensure that we could continue to disperse the illegal blockade and illegal occupation. Tools like that, tools like the rapid deployment of the RCMP where we needed them to be, example here in Ottawa, were all tools that we continued to need up until the last possible moment. And once we were informed by police that there was no longer a state of emergency, we took that under very careful advisement. But the flip side is—
When did they inform you? Sorry to interrupt, Minister. When did law enforcement inform you there was no longer an emergency?
Very recently, and certainly within the last number of hours, there's been a growing consensus that we were no longer at a state of emergency.
So just today, law enforcement informed you of that. Is that accurate?
When we hit that, we're no longer at that threshold, and when we were sure and confident that police would be able to use existing authorities, then we were able to make the decision to revoke.
With respect, Minister, you didn't answer, though, beyond just recently when law enforcement told you that the act—
I said within the last number of hours, Vashi.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you at that moment. So today you were told by law enforcement. And previous to today, is it accurate to say that law enforcement told you, no, we still need these powers?
Yes, by extension, as we were making the transition out of an emergency, there was still an ongoing need to use the authorities under the Emergencies Act. So, for example, in Winnipeg, there were some notices and cautions given to those who were within the area adjacent to the legislature there that they should vacate because of the Emergencies Act, along with other existing authorities. And this is another important feature of the Emergencies Act, is that it works in concert with existing authorities.
I'm sure you're familiar with the assessment that some have made that the reason that the federal government had to intervene in this fashion was because other levels of government or law enforcement itself failed to do their job. What do you say to the concern that in the next instance that law enforcement fails to do its job, the federal government will invoke this act, that the precedent has now been set that should police not be able to arrest protesters, the federal government will give itself more power?
Yeah, look, I think it's an important question. And that's one of the things that is very good about the Emergencies Act, is that it builds in a lot of transparency as you are using the exceptional powers that have been circumscribed under it. So the parliamentary debate that we've just had over the last number of days was important. And I would note that there was bipartisan support across the NDP Greens and our party to confirm the invocation of the Emergencies Act. There's also the Joint Committee which will study it, as well as the mandatory inquiry, which needs to begin within 60 days. All of those are incredibly important mechanisms to look at the kind of questions that you just talked about, which is making sure that there is a seamless integration and capacity to respond to a potential urgent situation and an emergency without the need to invoke the Emergencies Act. So we'll be looking very carefully at those lessons.
Do you think, based on the information you have and what you've witnessed over the last 10 days as Minister of Public Safety, that law enforcement initially failed to do its job?
Well, I think there were definitely challenges. There's no doubt about that. You don't get to, the having to invoke the Emergencies Act without there being some real lack of capacity to leverage existing authorities. And that was one of the things that we looked at very, very carefully in accordance with the requirements under the law. And so I think that in some communities, we were able to see that local law enforcement was able to quickly deal with the illegal blockades and occupation but in other instances, there were challenges. And as a result of the Emergencies Act, we saw significant progress to use the powers that had been very circumscribed, very targeted and time limited, and also exercised in a manner that is consistent with the Charter. Those are all important protections. And certainly there will be a robust debate about that as we get into the joint parliamentary committee and as well the inquiry. But that's one that I think all Canadians should embrace so that we never have a situation like this again.
Before I let you go, Minister, I certainly don't want to paint a picture where, or absolve nefariously intended protesters who came down here to blockade things and really disrupt people's lives. But a group of the people who were here were definitely upset about mandates. And in the last 10 days, 2 weeks, we have seen a number of provinces remove or say they intend to remove at a certain date those vaccine passports or vaccine mandates. Given what we know now about the transmissibility of Omicron and that we know that vaccinated people can transmit it, although they are protected from severe illness and death, of course, is your government considering lifting the mandate under federal jurisdiction?
Well, first, I would completely agree with you that there has been a real vigorous debate about the pandemic, and the government's sincere and evidence-based belief is that vaccinations is the way to get out. But we will continue to follow the advice. You saw some decisions as recently as last week, I believe, around an easing of some of the requirements at the border to facilitate travel, but at the same time, keeping some measures in place to protect and guard against the transmission of Omicron and other variants. I would just make the point that we need to put that group of Canadians who are law-abiding and who are genuinely exasperated, as we all are with the pandemic, with the illegal conduct that we saw in Ottawa, at our borders, and in other communities. And that's why we had to invoke the Emergencies Act. We did it for specific reasons, and it had the desired effect of allowing us to address what was an emergency.
And I am trying to distinguish very much so between the two. And my question is about the former, right? My question is about whether or not the federal government, I'm not even saying announce, mandates are gone. I don't know whether the evidence or the science supports that, but your government has thus far not even expressed a willingness to consider that.
Yeah, no, I would respectfully disagree, Vashi. I think we've always been open to different ideas around how to get around which measures are appropriate at which time. And there are decisions which are supported at every juncture by the evidence and by the advice that we're getting from our chief public health officer. It's natural that people want to get out of the pandemic. Vashi, it's been 2 years. We all want out of the pandemic. But we also will continue to use evidence and science as our North Star, as well as debate in the chamber, in our legislatures, because that's what democracies do. We resolve our debates in a respectful and in a democratic manner, not by resorting to violence, intimidation, harassment, or hate. And that has been one of the emerging lessons out of this emergency.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.